When Jake inherited his grandfather's farm, he never expected to become the target of a ruthless HOA, but when they bulldozed his $5 million barn, he swore one thing: Karen would pay for this, with her freedom. Jake Matthews had always known he would inherit his grandfather's farm, but he never expected the transition to be this chaotic. The land had been in his family for 3 generations, a sprawling 300-acre property in rural Texas, rich with history, hard work, and an unmistakable sense of freedom. His grandfather had spent his life cultivating the land, investing in modern equipment, and preserving the rustic but fully operational barn that housed not only valuable machinery, but also a collection of rare, antique tractors, some worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. For Jake, taking over the farm wasn't just about maintaining a business. It was about continuing a legacy. The first few months were peaceful. He settled into the routine of running the farm, waking up before sunrise, tending to the fields, and overseeing maintenance. But the tranquility didn't last. Not long after he moved in, he received a formal-looking letter from the Sunnyside Ridge HOA, the homeowners association that governed the affluent suburban development bordering his property. The letter was a demand, not a request. It claimed that his barn was an eyesore, a violation of community aesthetic standards, and needed to be removed. At first, Jake was certain it was a mistake. His land had never been part of the HOA, nor had his grandfather ever agreed to any such regulations. He ignored the letter, assuming someone had simply failed to check property records. But within a week, a second letter arrived, this time more aggressive, citing specific bylaws and warning of potential legal action. Then came Karen Bradley. She showed up unannounced one afternoon, stepping out of her pristine white SUV with a clipboard in hand, exuding the confidence of someone who believed they controlled everything within a 10-mile radius. She was the president of the HOA, a woman in her mid-50s, with an air of entitlement and a patronizing smile. "Mr. Matthews," she began, eyeing him as if she were doing him a favor by speaking to him, "I assume you've received our notices?" Jake folded his arms. "I have. And I also assume you know my property isn't part of your HOA." Karen's smile didn't waver, but her tone sharpened. "It may not be under direct jurisdiction, but Sunnyside Ridge prides itself on maintaining high community standards. Your structure disrupts the aesthetic harmony we've worked so hard to establish." Jake let out a dry laugh. "My barn? This barn has been here longer than your whole neighborhood. My grandfather built it before there was a single house within 5 miles." Karen pursed her lips. "Be that as it may, our homeowners have concerns. We would appreciate your cooperation in addressing them before this escalates further." He saw the veiled threat beneath her words. But Jake wasn't about to back down. "Not happening," he said flatly. "You have no authority here." Karen studied him for a moment, then simply nodded. "If that's your position, Mr. Matthews, then I suppose we'll have to explore other avenues." With that, she turned and walked back to her SUV, driving off without another word. Jake knew then that this wasn't over. And he was right. Within days, we started noticing parked near his property, taking pictures. Some even got out of their cars to inspect the fence line, as if looking for a legal loophole that would allow them to challenge his claim. Then came the anonymous complaints. A sudden influx of calls to local authorities alleging everything from improper land use to environmental violations. Inspectors arrived at his farm without warning, citing routine checks on zoning compliance. Each time, they left with nothing to report. But the pattern was clear. Someone was trying to harass him into submission. Jake installed security cameras along his fence line. He wasn't about to be intimidated, but then something changed. The tactics grew bolder. Someone cut the lock on his barn door, leaving it wide open one morning. Nothing was stolen, but the message was clear. They weren't just trying to push him. They wanted to force him out. And Jake was done playing nice. The harassment escalated quickly. At first, it had been passive-aggressive letters and veiled threats, but now the Sunnyside Ridge HOA was taking direct action. They weren't just trying to intimidate Jake. They were actively working to sabotage him. The first real blow came when his primary equipment supplier suddenly canceled his contract. The company had been providing fuel, fertilizers, and maintenance parts to his farm for years, but out of nowhere, they sent him a curt email stating they were reevaluating partnerships in the area. When Jake called to demand an explanation, the representative hesitated before finally admitting that someone from the HOA had reached out to their corporate office, claiming his farm was under review for zoning violations and that working with him could bring them legal trouble. It was a blatant lie, but effective nonetheless. A few days later, the local bank followed suit. Jake had been approved for a business loan extension just weeks prior, but suddenly they were unable to proceed due to unforeseen circumstances. Digging deeper, he discovered that members of the HOA had been pressuring financial institutions, spreading rumors that his property was at risk of legal seizure. The goal was clear: cut off his resources, cripple his operations, and force him to sell. But HOA wasn't content with just hitting his business. They wanted to bury him in red tape. Within 2 weeks, Jake received a cease and desist order from the local zoning board, stating that multiple complaints had been filed against him regarding improper land use. Allegedly, his barn exceeded height restrictions, and there were concerns about environmental impact due to machinery emissions. These were ridiculous claims, especially since his farm predated the very regulations they cited. Jake fought back, submitting his property records, environmental assessments, and historic land use documents, proving his compliance with all county laws. His lawyer assured him these challenges wouldn't hold up in court, but fighting them cost time and money, resources the HOA was trying to drain. Then came the property inspection teams, showing up unannounced, citing anonymous concerns about safety hazards. One inspector even tried to claim Jake's barn had structural instability and might need to be demolished. Jake had had enough. He confronted the inspector, demanding to know where these complaints were coming from. The man hesitated but finally admitted they were all submitted by members of the HOA. That night, Jake checked his security footage and saw something that made his blood boil. A group of men in dark clothing had been on his property at 2 a.m., tampering with his barn. The next morning, he found bolts loosened on his equipment, locks cut, and parts missing. It wasn't just intimidation anymore. They were actively trying to sabotage him. Jake wasn't about to take this lying down. He met with his lawyer, outlining every attack against him. The supplier intimidation, the banking pressure, the fraudulent complaints, and now, outright trespassing. He had enough evidence to fight back. But HOA wasn't finished yet. Karen had one more card to play. And this time, she wasn't just aiming to hurt his business. She was coming for his land. Jake woke up to the sound of heavy machinery rumbling outside his window. The low metallic groan of gears grinding against dirt sent a spike of adrenaline through his veins. He bolted upright, grabbed his phone, and sprinted to the front porch. His barn, his family's legacy, his business's heart, was surrounded by construction crews. A yellow bulldozer loomed in front of it, engine roaring, its massive steel blade already tearing into the barn's front wall. Planks splintered, metal groaned, the roof sagged. Workers in orange vests and hard hats swarmed the area, shouting instructions as the demolition unfolded before his eyes. Jake's stomach twisted. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. "Stop!" he roared, sprinting toward the chaos. "Get the hell off my land!" A foreman turned, startled, and hesitated before motioning for the bulldozer to halt. Karen Bradley stood nearby, clipboard in hand, a smug smile curving her lips. "You're trespassing, Matthews," she said, her voice dripping with faux authority. "This structure has been condemned. We're clearing the site for you." Jake's fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. "Condemned by WHO? You don't have any legal authority here." Karen sighed theatrically, flipping a page on her clipboard. "Oh, but we do." The county approved an emergency demolition order. According to public records, this barn was deemed structurally unsound and a safety hazard. She glanced up at the half-destroyed building, as if she were doing him a favor. "We're simply ensuring community safety." Jake's head spun. An emergency demolition order? There was no way. He had meticulously maintained the barn, reinforced it last year, and passed every previous inspection. This was fraud. His mind snapped into action. He whipped out his phone, already dialing 911. "You're destroying private property," he snapped. "This is criminal trespassing, vandalism, and fraud. I have security cameras. I have documentation proving this barn is sound." Karen's smirk faltered, but she quickly masked it. "Feel free to call whomever you like, but the work is legally authorized. You should have cooperated when we asked you nicely." Jake shoved past a worker and made his way to the half-demolished barn door. His stomach churned at the sight. Equipment worth millions was already buried under debris. Tractors crushed. Precision farming tools mangled. An antique Ford Model B, a priceless family heirloom, lay twisted under a collapsed support beam. $5 million in losses. Gone in a matter of minutes. The wail of sirens cut through the morning air. Jake turned to see 3 patrol cars and a county sheriff's vehicle barreling down his driveway. Officers jumped out before the cars had fully stopped, weapons lowered, but at the ready. One officer, a grizzled-looking sheriff with a stern face, strode toward Jake. "We got reports of property destruction and trespassing. What the hell is going on here?" Karen stepped forward confidently, flashing her clipboard. "Officer, there's no issue here. This demolition was approved by the county." Jake cut her off, stepping between her and the sheriff. "That's a lie. They forged documents to get this approved. My barn was in perfect condition, and I can prove it." He jabbed a finger toward his security cameras mounted along the fence line. The sheriff snatched the clipboard from Karen's hands and examined it. His eyes narrowed. "You said this was approved by the county? Because I know for a fact I would have been notified about demolition order on private land, and I don't recall seeing anything about this." Karen's expression flickered. Just for a second, but it was enough. Another officer spoke up. "Sheriff, I just called the zoning office. There's no record of an emergency demolition order." The silence was deafening. Then, the sheriff's gaze turned ice cold as he looked at Karen. "Ms. Bradley, I think you'd better come with us." Jake's breath came in hard, furious bursts as 2 officers pulled out handcuffs. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The damage was done. And now, he was going to make sure Karen paid for it. Jake didn't waste a second. The moment Karen was cuffed and placed into the back of a police cruiser, he turned to the sheriff. "I need access to every document related to this demolition order. I need to know who signed off on it, who approved the contractors, and who authorized payment." The sheriff nodded. "We'll subpoena the records. But if she forged anything, this isn't just a civil case. It's criminal fraud, destruction of property, and conspiracy." Jake didn't just want compensation, he wanted justice. Over the next 48 hours, he worked alongside his attorney, collecting every piece of evidence he had. Surveillance footage, maintenance records proving the barn was structurally sound, emails from the HOA pressuring him to sell, and complaints from local businesses confirming that Karen had orchestrated a campaign against him. Then came the biggest bombshell. Jake's lawyer managed to obtain county records, and they did include a demolition request. But here was the kicker. The signature authorizing it wasn't from any legitimate zoning official. It was a forgery. Karen had faked government approval to demolish his barn. Even worse, further investigation revealed a financial paper trail leading straight to her personal bank account. HOA funds had been used to pay the demolition crew, a blatant case of embezzlement. Jake wasn't the only one furious. HOA members, many of whom had blindly followed Karen's leadership, turned on her instantly. At an emergency meeting, members demanded answers as accusations flew. How much of their money had she stolen? How many other false reports had she filed? Meanwhile, Jake and his attorney filed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against Karen and the HOA. They sought 1. $5 million in damages for the destroyed barn and lost equipment. 2, punitive damages for fraudulent activity. 3, a full audit of HOA finances. The media caught wind of the scandal, and soon Karen's name was plastered across every local news outlet. The headline was damning. HOA president caught in fraud scandal, illegal demolition exposed. Jake wasn't done yet. With all eyes on the case, he made sure Karen had no escape. He met with state prosecutors, who took one look at the forged documents and financial records, and immediately filed felony charges against her. Fraud, forgery, embezzlement, conspiracy to commit property destruction. Karen had gone from HOA queen to criminal defendant in less than a week, and Jake, he was just getting started. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, disgruntled HOA members, local farmers, and even city officials had gathered to witness the downfall of Karen Bradley, the woman who had spent years bullying an entire community under the guise of maintaining order. But today, she wasn't in charge. Today, she was the defendant in a felony trial facing multiple counts of fraud, forgery, embezzlement, and destruction of private property. Jake sat with his attorney, his fists clenched as the prosecution laid out the case. The evidence was overwhelming. First, the forged demolition order. A county official took the stand and confirmed that his signature had been faked. Karen had manipulated official documents to make it appear as if Jake's barn had been condemned. The prosecution projected the evidence onto a screen for the jury to see, the false signature glowing under forensic analysis. The forgery was undeniable. Next, the embezzlement. A forensic accountant testified that Karen had stolen over $200,000 from HOA funds to pay for the demolition and line her own pockets. Bank records showed direct transfers from HOA accounts to Karen's personal offshore savings account. Then came the surveillance footage. Clips from Jake's security cameras showed HOA members trespassing on his land at night, cutting locks and tampering with equipment. Even more damning, a separate video captured Karen herself standing in front of the demolition crew, clipboard in hand, giving the order to bulldoze the barn. The courtroom was silent as the final piece of evidence was presented. An insurance evaluation stating that Jake's losses exceeded $5 million. His farm's entire infrastructure had been built around that barn. Its destruction had nearly ruined him. Karen's defense crumbled. Her lawyer tried to argue that she had simply misunderstood her authority as HOA president. But the prosecution shredded that excuse. HOA rules had zero legal jurisdiction over Jake's farm. She had acted deliberately, knowingly, and with malicious intent. Then came the testimonies. One by one, former HOA members took the stand, exposing Karen's reign of corruption and intimidation. Residents spoke of unlawful fines, harassment, and threats she had used to control them. A small business owner revealed how Karen had extorted money in exchange for permits. The more they spoke, the clearer it became. Karen had spent years abusing her power, and she had finally crossed a line she couldn't erase. When the jury left to deliberate, the tension in the courtroom was unbearable. They were gone for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood, cleared his throat, and read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. A ripple of gasps filled the courtroom. Karen's face drained of color. Then came the judge's ruling. Given the severity of her crimes, the calculated nature of her fraud, and the immense financial and emotional damage she had caused, the court had no choice but to hand down a severe punishment. The defendant is hereby sentenced to 10 years in state prison. A stunned silence followed. Karen opened her mouth, but no sound came out. For the first time in her life, she had no control. As the bailiffs approached to take her into custody, Karen snapped. She whirled on Jake, screaming, "You ruined me! You think this is over? You think—" Her words were cut off as an officer grabbed her wrists and locked the cuffs around them. Jake watched as Karen Bradley, the woman who had once tried to run his life, was led away in chains, and he felt nothing but satisfaction. The fall of Karen Bradley sent shockwaves through the community. The Sunnyside Ridge HOA, once a powerful and feared entity, was now crumbling under the weight of lawsuits, audits, and a complete loss of public trust. Jake didn't just take down Karen, he dismantled the very system that had enabled her. In the weeks following the trial, a court-ordered forensic audit uncovered years of corruption. It turned out that Karen had been skimming tens of thousands of dollars from HOA funds for years, issuing fraudulent fines to residents, and even colluding with city inspectors to intimidate homeowners into compliance. The HOA board, desperate to save themselves, resigned en masse, leaving the once feared association in complete disarray. The final blow came when a group of residents filed a class action lawsuit against the HOA, demanding refunds for fraudulent fees and damages for harassment. With legal fees mounting and no leadership left to defend it, the HOA was officially dissolved. Homeowners rejoiced as the oppressive rules vanished overnight. For the first time in years, they could paint their homes the colors they wanted, plant gardens without fear of fines, and live without constant surveillance. Jake, however, was focused on rebuilding. With the $5 million settlement he won, he didn't just replace what had been lost, he expanded. A new, state-of-the-art barn rose from the ashes, larger and better equipped than before. He installed advanced security systems, hired additional farmhands, and even invested in renewable energy projects to make the farm more sustainable. One afternoon, as he walked the property, admiring the progress, a group of former HOA members arrived at his gate. They weren't there to harass him anymore. They wanted to apologize. A woman who had once sided with Karen stepped forward. "We were wrong about you, Jake," she admitted. "We should have stood up to her, but we were scared." Jake studied them for a moment, then nodded. "Fear keeps people in line," he said simply. "But it doesn't have to control you forever." That evening, Jake hosted a celebratory barbecue on his farm, inviting neighbors, even the ones who had once opposed him. It wasn't about gloating. It was about moving forward. The people of Sunnyside Ridge weren't enemies anymore. They were free. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake leaned against his fence, watching his farm thrive once again. Karen was in prison. The HOA was gone, and he had won. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for every homeowner who had ever been bullied, every farmer who had been underestimated, and every person who had ever been told to fall in line. Jake Matthews had stood his ground. And in the end, justice had prevailed.